tell me, what kind of army did Henry V cross the Channel with for that campaign, the Agincourt campaign?
Okay, so the English were not as rich as the French. So, medieval armies were predominantly men-at-arms, knights, men in armour, out to seek honour, fortune, glory, and they were the fighting machines of medieval battles. But the English found out at the early part of the 100 Years' War that they could field archers for much less money, and they could be extremely effective. So by the time Henry V took his force over, it was, by the time they reached Agincourt, it was probably about 1,500 men-at-arms and 7,000 archers. So that proportion tells you a lot about the way they intended to fight. But of course, part of that was not for Agincourt, but was for the sieges, for Harfleur. What he was there for was to take territory. He had this, in his eyes, claim to the French throne, and he got some money from Parliament because he thought, well, this is going to be great. If I get some of these French territories, then they'll pay taxes. So the English were very in favour of this robbery. Let's go and take some French land, and it'll ease our tax burden because they'll be paying tax. It wasn't an English-French thing in the way that we think of it now. And everyone goes about the old rivalry and all of that. This was just greedy kings trying to grab some territory. And the people who went along with him went along for the adventure and to earn some money. These were paid people, not patriots. So the archers, 7,000 archers. They were butchers and bakers and candlestick makers and smiths, and they'd sign up for 40-day service or whatever at 6 a day. Also, usually expecting to get a bit of loot. They could come back and start their own business instead of working for somebody else. I mean, this was an enterprise.
And what was it about 15th century England and Wales that made them? And what was it about 15th century England and Wales that caused there to be a giant reservoir of very strong men who turns out were fantastic archers, whilst also being candlestick makers?
Yeah. Opportunity, financial opportunity. So it's interesting that you're saying England and Wales, which of course is correct because Scotland is very different. And of course, after Agincourt, Scottish archers went and fought for the Joan of Arc and the armies of France. So the Welsh did not invent the longbow. The longbow is a Neolithic weapon. It's been going on a very long time. But they did use it very effectively in their wars against Edward I. So that's when we first start to see the longbow being used. And Edward I picked up on that very quickly and saw, that relatively inexpensive troops could be enormously effective, in that case, in guerrilla warfare. And he started paying them. And he took them in his campaigns to Scotland. And so through the Edwards, 1, 2, 3, we get this increase in the archery of England and Wales. And laws come into place requiring people to practice on a Sunday and to give up vain sports like bandyball and football and other such things. In fact, later on, there's a Scottish edict that tells you to give up golf and practice your archery. So there was a lot of... It would be true to say that all archery cultures, whether you're talking about the Japanese or the Chinese or the Ottomans or the English, once they start writing about their archery, they all give it a certain moral value and a certain health benefit value. It's something all these archery cultures have in common. And I sort of agree with them. You know, I mean, it is quite meditative. It expands your lungs, so it's breathing, and, you know, good breathing is the heart of a lot of health regimens, etc., etc. So they were very aware that this is a healthy, good, manly exercise to build a nation with moral fibre. So it had that little undercurrent going with it. But the real reason that people went to practice was to be good because it had financial opportunity. Getting a gig, going on an expedition was, you know, a relatively short-term adventure, and you could come back with a bit of loot.
And talk to me about these longbows. How powerful are they? The old question, can they punch through plate armour? Are they the medieval machine gun? Give me a sense of their potency.
Okay, so
here we go.
This is the heart of the matter. My own view is that we are all far too distracted by the penetration debate, and that what really matters is how hard can you hit them and how often could you hit them, because the blunt trauma wears down troops. Now, can an arrow penetrate armour? Yes, it can. Did all arrows penetrate all armour? No, because otherwise everyone would be dead. I mean, there's a lot we don't know, but there is something we do know, and that is that everybody on the French side did not die. High casualties, yes, but they didn't all die. If you've got 7,000 longbowmen, you know, they emptied their quivers, which they did. They didn't run out of arrows at Agincourt. Agincourt was much more about the archers getting stuck in than the archery, but although the archery was important. So everybody isn't dead. So why are you taking 7,000 archers? What are they doing? Well, it's a range weapon. But what is that range? So we know that in their practice they had to shoot 280 yards. I don't think that's indicative necessarily of what they had to do in battle. The first image we get of an arrow storm, of arrows flying through the air like that, is in Laurence Olivier's 1944 film Henry V. It's never been seen before. And now it's seen in every Hollywood movie since, but that was a Larry Olivier invention. All medieval art shows archers shooting pretty much straight on, unless they're in a siege. So there's no artistic convention that prevents you shooting up in the air, because you see it at sieges, they're shooting in the air. So they're all shooting horizontally. So that's suggesting to me that perhaps they didn't arc all that much. A medieval arrow is a very sophisticated and expensive piece of ammunition. There are so many stages to making it. You start with cleft wood that's in squares that you've got to round. You know, you don't go down to B&Q and get doweling. You've got to make that, and you shape it. You barrel it so it tapers at one end, it's fatter in the middle, and tapers at the other. It's a very sophisticated bit of carpentry to start off with. Then you've got to cut and fashion the feathers and stick them on with rabbit hide glue, and then that's not strong enough, so you have to whip bind them with silk thread to make sure they don't come off. Then you've got to cut a nock and reinforce that by a transverse cut in which you put a sliver of horn, and that's before you go to the smith to have the arrowhead made. So what you can't do is you can't knock them up in the camp the night before. You have to take these supplies. So maybe you take a couple of million. But actually with 7,000 archers, you can get through a couple of million arrows very quickly. What you don't know is that your last battle? Are you going to have to fight the next day? Are you going to have to fight a week later? So a commander of an army needs to be very aware of husbanding his arrow resources. He needs to be equally aware of husbanding his archers' stamina. Now, obviously, they don't all have to shoot at once, and I'm sure they would have shoot in blocks and rotations. But it's, you know, if you get down the gym and you can, goodness knows what you can press, but I'm sure it's jolly impressive. But you know, if somebody's pressing 200 pounds on a bench press in the gym, great, very impressive. But how many times can they do it? And if they push themselves too far, what are they good for afterwards? An archer has to be able to get into hand-to-hand fighting at the end of a battle. The battle goes on for several hours. How many times can you pull back a bow that's, you know, between 120 and 180 pounds draw weight? We know that there are modern archers who can shoot bows of 200 pounds draw weight. And we know from the girth of the bows from the Mary Rose, although it is, you know, more than a century later, we know that the bows look to be in that ballpark between 120 and 180 pounds draw weight. The fact that somebody can pull 200 pounds doesn't mean to say that's the optimum for a battle, because I said, well, it's all about repetitions. You've got to shoot and shoot and shoot. So I think 120, 160 is the sort of power, and that's a phenomenal amount of power. I mean, bear in mind the average Olympic archer is shooting about 30 pounds, 40 pounds. So I mean, we were talking about staggering power with these bows. And if you look at a medieval longbow arrow, I mean, it's a tree trunk, it's a mighty stick, it's a great big thing. So you're really sending great thump into the enemy. And I believe that's the most important aspect, is you're hitting him at range. And the question is, at what range? We say at range, but 10 yards is at range, 20 yards is at range, 30 yards, 40 yards is at range. If you compare it to the age of the musket, then the musket is a ranged weapon, but it wasn't being used at 200 yards. It's being used effectively at 30, 40, maybe 50 yards. It's not really very effective after that. So you're still using a ranged weapon, and that ties in with what we see with medieval art. So you're making your limited arrow resources count. You're hitting harder than you would at long range. You are able to target and have greater accuracy at that range. And it's when the enemy is at your front door, then you can't slack. So, you know, the enemy charge, they don't charge, wave and turn away. They charge and engage, and there's a fight with your men-at-arms and with your spearmen, and then there's a fight on the front line. That's when your archers need to get in there and hit and hit and hit and hit. Armour will fail. There will be weak spots. We know armour got penetrated, but to what extent, it's debatable. I don't think very much, but I think it is this repetitive slugging match of hard hits, as hard as a sledgehammer. It depends on the angle of strike, how hard the hit is. So, you know, if you take a flat sheet of metal and you get an arrow going absolutely perpendicular, then all the energy stacks up down the shaft behind it and delivers maximum energy. But the chances of that, especially on the curved and moving surface of a man in some armour, it's going to have some angle. And as soon as there's some angle, then you start to get some bend with the arrow breaks and fragments, you're not getting the full drive behind the thing, and you get deflection from the armour. How we calculate those percentages, I don't know. But he calculated it by saying, I need 7,000 archers.
Trust Henry V. Well, but that is a bleak description of charging into man and horse, yes, albeit covered in armour, but repeatedly getting sledgehammer blows that might not be penetrating, but it's going to sap your morale, let's put it that way. You're going to think about turning around and getting out of there.
It's fighting. That's what they're doing, is they're fighting. I mean, a sword's not going to cut through armour either. A mace doesn't cut through armour either. That's what they were doing. They were clobbering each other. A longbow wasn't a magic stick. It was just a really good, relatively inexpensive, powerful weapon for delivering thump after thump after thump.
Brilliant. Right, let's get to the campaign itself. Henry V, he's trying to capture bits of France, reigniting that Plantagenet claim to the French throne. He starts in Harfleur, does he?
He starts in Harfleur, which is a siege that takes much, much, much longer than he anticipated. But he gets it in the end. And don't forget, there's an amount of gunnery going on with this as well. It's not all bows and arrows. There is dysentery breaks out in the camp. And of course, one of the many, many, many myths of Agincourt is that this poor ragged army with dysentery turns up to fight the battle. Well, most of the folk who got dysentery in the Harfleur camp got sent back to England and reinforcements came. So he didn't have such a ragtag army when it came to Agincourt.
Because he decides, so Harfleur's modern Le Havre is effectively,
Yeah.
big, not today, a huge big port, so very well positioned, but he decides to march back overland, doesn't he?
Yes. There's a river called the Somme. The French were assembling, but they weren't sure where he was going to go. They knew he was plotting an invasion. They weren't quite sure where he was going to come. And France is a big country, and to assemble an army takes time. And he kind of kept the river between them. And that was part of the reason for why he was taking that route.
And he ends up, but he's heading for Calais, is he?
Yeah, he's going to go home.
So he's heading, but he decides to march across northwest France just to demonstrate his sovereignty. He's going to march across northwest France.
A little bit of a peacock strut, I think, yes.
But the French intercept him.
They do, and it seems that they picked the battle site, which, given that it was the terrain that ultimately defeated them, was a bit of a poor call. But it seems they, lured him to battle or summoned him to battle there, and he took that challenge. And a lot of what went wrong for the French was it was a battle site that didn't suit them. So by this stage, most French armies, or most armies in general, had learned of the power of the longbow, particularly against cavalry, and sent their men in dismounted. Men at arms went in on foot. That's just as much true of the French as anyone else. But Boucicaut, the Constable of France, had a plan that, because there were so many archers, this was time for a cavalry charge, because archers are very vulnerable to cavalry. We all think, how vulnerable the horses are to archers, which is true. But archers are far more vulnerable in undefended ground to cavalry, because they just smash through. From being out of bow shot to arriving at the front line, it's only 30 to 40 seconds.
It's a bit of a grim half minute, but if you can get through the beaten zone...
Yeah, you get through that beaten zone, you're in there and you're amongst them. I just got charged by my horse earlier this year, and he broke 4 ribs and punctured a lung. And I think being hit by a horse is quite... It's quite a powerful thing, I can tell you. That's why they were going to do the cavalry charge, but because Henry had captured some prisoners and got intelligence of this plan, that's why they cut the famous stakes, great big, thick, glove fist thick stakes, sharpened and stuck in the ground against this cavalry charge. Even so, there's gaps between them, and people, they did get through to some extent. But where Henry really gained was by putting his archers around the flanks. The whole thing was a taper, and there was woodland here, and woodland's awful for cavalry, but it's great for hiding archers who can get out of the way. And he sent a lot of his archers down the flanks. So by the time the French came in, they were even able to come round from behind. So that the French absolutely caught in this pincer movement. So the archery was enormously effective. Certainly some people would have been killed with hits, but I do not believe the Laurence Olivier image of these ragged men stood behind these stakes, launching these volleys at distance. That's not how it was.
Nor were they craned onto their horses, unable to move. How agile were men-at-arms in armour?
They were enormously agile. They were athletes. They were supreme athletes. Fighting was their job. So, the aristocracy at that period, that was their job, to be an elite soldier, a crack troop. And they would train in armor. So Boucicaut, for instance, the French commander, one of the French commanders, he was famed that he would go for a mile run in his armor every day. He could climb up the underside of a ladder wearing full armor just with his hands, going up like that. I, even as a late middle-aged man, have thrown myself off a horse in full armor to show that you can spring to your feet straight away in it. What went wrong at Agincourt was the mud. So that area of northern France, as you know, has a particularly sort of loamy, viscous, sticky mud. Just to try and walk across a field in your wellies is hard enough work, because it all clags and clogs, and then you're suddenly carrying, diver's boot weight on your feet, and you can hardly move. So the planished surfaces of armor really collected this mud. So if knights were struck down from their horses, if their horses were shot beneath them, then they probably did find it difficult to get up because of the mud, but not because of the armor. Just that the armor stuck to the mud a lot. So the terrain was very much against them.
So it's shallow, sort of a valley, wooded sides, very muddy, and that gives the English an advantage because there are fewer troops, and they could a little bit like the Spartans at Thermopylae. It's a yes. Narrow entrance. They can their frontage is quite short.
Yes, and it doesn't matter how many men you've got behind. It's only the ones in the front who can fight. So, after the cavalry charges, which were decimated by the archers, particularly because of this being able to shoot from the flanks and getting round behind. So the cavalry charge was a bit of a disaster. And there were leadership mistakes. Something people forget is that the French had 4,000 longbowmen and about 1,500 crossbowmen waiting in the rear. They just never called them forward. The French had learned long before the value of longbow archery, and they had French archers. They had them. They just didn't bring them forward. So when we talk about the numbers at Agincourt, there are two things to keep in mind. A, the numbers of the English are slightly greater than we used to think because of the wonderful work by Dr. Anne Curry. We have so many records for Agincourt. And she has determined there were about 1,500 men-at-arms and about 7,000 archers. So that's 8,500 man army on the English side. On the French side, the ones they didn't use don't really count. So the fact that they had, 4,000 longbow archers at the back that were never called forward, because us knights are going to sort it out, it doesn't really count. So they probably only fielded about 10,000. So it isn't this, band of brothers, we few, we happy few. It was relatively equal numbers. There's a disparity in the type of troops, but the numbers are similar. But as you so rightly point out, it's the size of the front that counts. It doesn't matter if you've got 10,000 men-at-arms against our 1,500. It's only the front row that can fight. And the ones at the back are stuck being shot at by archers from the flanks.
Talk about the French leadership. How did that play out?
I think it wasn't as silly as Shakespeare portrayed it. And any discussion of Agincourt has to keep coming back to Shakespeare, and in modern times has to keep coming back to the Olivier film, because this is where the national myth is born and perpetuated. So then Olivier's film was released in France in 1947, and there were worries at the time that it would affect Anglo-French relations, which of course were very good just after the Second World War, and we didn't want to upset, because it portrayed the French as such buffoons and concerned only with self-aggrandizement, etc. And of course there is the scene of the knights being winched onto their horses. To go back to your agility question, that is an image put into that Olivier Henry V film, which is completely bogus. The story goes that Olivier went to see Sir James Mann, who was the then master of the armories at the Tower of London, which is where they were then, to consult. And Mann had said, I do hope you're not going to have this silly notion of knights being winched on their saddle. Because there was a play called In Days of Old When Knights Were Bold, in which a fat knight had this happen to him. So that's where the myth had come from in the 19th century. And Olivier said, well, why not? It's so theatrical, it's so good. And the man said, yeah, but it didn't happen. They could spring up from the ground, get on from the stirrup. And Olivier apparently said, very well, I shall only have the French do it. And so we get that thing where, oh, the stupid French, and oh, they're so vainglorious. And well, actually, they were some of the finest knights of the Middle Ages, Boucicaut in particular, the commander. But they did have command rivalries. They actually had a good plan. If you've got an army of 7,000 English archers, smashing them with cavalry is a pretty good idea. It was just unfortunate that they picked the wrong terrain, and I don't know how that happened. And Henry V did outsmart by putting those archers round on the flanks and by getting those stakes cut. But I think it's too easy to condemn the French leadership for mistakes. I think you do need to give Henry V some generalship credit for the way he marshalled that army.
So the French launched these massive cavalry attacks. They're broken up largely by archery.
And then they send their men in on foot, which is what they were always going to do. It wasn't a surprise to them. They just tried the cavalry charge, thinking they'd be able to smash the archers up, because half of the archers were in the woods and the stakes stopped them.
And what happens to this when finally the men-at-arms clash?
Then you get this traffic jam. Then you get this fact that you've got this narrow front, you've got archers at the side, which incidentally is another thing against this idea of these big arcing volleys, because what the accounts are telling us is that the French are crammed together, they can barely move. Well, of course, if you were got people putting arcing volleys into them, it would spread them out. So it's the men at the sides who are helping to funnel them into this taper and crush the French front, so that you can't fight if you can't lift your arm. If the chap next to you is standing here, so they are and being pushed from behind, where people who want to get into the battle and win their share of the glory that day. And so yeah, it was a disaster for the French. And then who knows what happened with the camp and the prisoners, because of course infamously Henry V had the prisoners killed. Was there a French attack coming around the back that he needed to do that? Was it simply with his numbers he couldn't handle it? Was it a terror tactic? I think that's very hard to interpret. But it pretty much wrapped up the battle. There was no rout. The French just left.
So the French, how long do you reckon that, it's impossible to ask, but how long do you reckon that decisive phase lasted of men-at-arms fighting in a shield wall with archers pummeling them from either flank? How long would that maelstrom have gone on for?
It is very difficult to say. And And the only thing we can say, again, there's a level where, our biology hasn't changed. So, we can look at our elite athletes. And if you look at boxers, for instance, who would be an elite athlete in a combat sport, delivering and receiving blows of the kind of intent that you would need to do in a medieval battle. It's no good tapping somebody with your sword. You've got to hit them with the same force as a heavyweight boxer. You've got to pull bows of a strength that will deliver the same kind of wallop as somebody swinging a sledgehammer. So it's work. It's joules of work. It's hard work. So how long can a boxer go? Not long, effectively. So you've got to have rotation at the front. I'll go in and slug a bit, and then I'll just step back, and Fred will step forward for a few minutes. And so you get a certain amount of that. With 7,000 archers, they don't all have to be shooting at the same time. Maybe only 700 shoot at the same time. You can have a rotation of so they get 5-minute breaks each and things. But it's still wearying work. And how long you can go on for, especially when you don't know how long you've got to go on for to fight for your life. And adrenaline helps, of course, but I don't know. I just don't know how long it could be.
So the French army collapses, they retreat. It's one of those famous battles in English history. And you've helped me understand, because previously, and yet only a generation later, England was catastrophically defeated in the 100 Years' War. But actually, it sounds to me like you're saying that there was no special source, particularly at Agincourt. It's just the French, just the circumstance, the battle, the terrain, the decisions made that one very one-sided battle. But the French army were easily capable of beating the English on their day.
Absolutely they were. And of course, subsequently, the French started to use a lot more archery. Which was one of the things that contributed to the thing. They also got very sophisticated with the new gunpowder weapons. But the thing about Agincourt was it's an iconic battle. But being iconic doesn't make it wasn't a particularly important battle. There was no threat to England from the French. This was simply Henry V seeking to expand his coffers by pursuing this slightly spurious claim to the French crown and trying to mop up some French territories that would pay him some taxes. So it was a private royal adventure that he recruited a band of folk who were happy to go and grab some extra money. It was land piracy with a band of brigands. So the nobility of it starts to get a bit sketchy once you understand that, and it isn't the old enemy, and it's these aristocratic rivalries, and then this idea of we few, we happy few. Well, the numbers weren't that different, and they weren't this ragged dysentery-ridden army. So a lot of these things start to fall away. And the archery was important, but the longbow was not a super weapon. It wasn't a magic stick. It has become such a tribal totem in British. I love longbows. They're just a thing of beauty, and then but in England they've become this tribal totem. Not so much because of the anti-foreigner sentiment, it's what made us win our wars, but in our society it's very much a class weapon, that this is the simple weapon that the common man could use to bring down the high and mighty nobility. You see, and that's such a powerful trope in our society, which is why I know every time I talk about Agincourt, I shall get distasteful internet comments, because you prick at these myths at one's expense. But it's the duty of historians to go, well, bad history leads that confuses national identity is a very dangerous thing. This idea that I do believe there is something about the national character that has a certain resilience and pluck and stubbornness and can hold out against the odds. But one can overplay one's hand with that without getting too topical. And the Agincourt myth is at the heart of that, and Shakespeare's rendition of it, which I love. I mean, when I was 10 when I saw it, they brought the film to school, and I was 10 when I saw that. And that film, seduced me into a lifetime of loving Shakespeare and his poetry, and got me interested in history in the Middle Ages. That was my moment, at the age of 10, seeing Henry V. I bought up every morsel of it. But it's only in later life that I've actually read some other books that you find, well, actually that propaganda film and that propaganda play wasn't entirely the truth.
I should though ask quickly, Henry V's battlefield leadership. What role do you think he took in the fighting?
According to the Jester Henrique, I mean, he was in the heart of it. You know, he had a fleuron cut from his crown, and he was in there in the thick of the fighting. I mean, that's very much in the spirit of medieval kingly leadership. You know, the Black Prince and did it at Crécy. He was in the fighting. So I wouldn't disbelieve that he was in the fighting, but I suspect it may have been over-exaggerated.
Well, that was a very impressive rendition. Your wonderful book, which we've already talked about in this podcast, is called
Warbows, and a lot of these arguments about how battlefield archery is effective are unpacked in much more nuanced detail.
Well, it's a brilliant book, so thank you very much for coming back on the podcast talking about Agincourt.
My pleasure. Thank you, Dan.
Welcome to the History Hit YouTube channel, which we are relaunching. We've got all the best exclusive content going straight onto this History Hit YouTube channel, and you can find out, for example, why on earth I'm standing at the top of this mast. You should probably subscribe.